Before I begin today, guys, I'd like to apologise in advance. My cold is mostly cleaned up, but I should be still a bit hoarse at times. And if it sounds more echoey, I am recording in a kitchen as opposed to my normal recording space. And if you can hear anything in the background, it will probably either be my dog or fireworks, as I'm recording this on New Year's Eve night. So yeah, here we go. Mirrors by Greensearcher. Chapter 18. Maurice was marching. Across bright green fields, surrounded by men in grey and blue uniforms that matched his own. Orders being shouted at them by officers on horseback as they dashed ahead of the line. It was gone in an instant. Grass was replaced by war-torn, dusty landscape. Blue clothes stained with red. Shouts eclipsed by the sound of 100 muskets firing at once. Dupont! Maurice turned, a familiar face beckoning him towards the trees. He followed, unable to avoid the piles of death beneath his feet. Hands sweating as he gripped his own weapon in his numb fingers. Even after months of using it, the gun still felt foreign to him. Nothing like the plough he was used to. They made it to a patch of dense growth, ducking quickly into a shallow ditch. "What are the odds that we both make it out of this alive, Thomas?" Maurice asked dryly, though the fear tugged at his chest. "Slim." The man chuckled darkly, glancing over his shoulder to scout the grounds for enemy soldiers. He leaned back, glancing at Maurice with a wry look. "Though one of us, there's a chance." Maurice frowned at that, gripping the weapon harder. "It's gotta be you," Thomas went on, mirth fading from his lips. "She's waiting for you, isn't she?" Soleil. The thought of her was his only patch of light in the death-infested darkness. Maurice swallowed roughly. "I'll place my bets on the slim chance," he said earnestly. "You're going to be my first man, right?" Thomas barked out a laugh, barely audible over the shouts and gunshots around them. Then he stopped, face splitting into a mess of blood. "No!" Maurice shouted. He couldn't hear his own voice, the shot that had killed his friend still ringing in his ears. Thomas fell, silent and dead, into his lap. Maurice choked back a groan, looking up. A musket was smoking paces away, gripped tight in an enemy's grasp. The soldier. No, the boy, looking no older than 15. He reached for the pouch at his hip, hands quaking as he began reloading his weapon. Maurice pushed himself to his feet, numb. He reached for his own musket, loading the ammunition quicker than any other could. He had made a few adjustments to the weapon, after all. He aimed at the soldier, feeling nothing. The boy finally looked up and caught sight of Maurice, eyes growing wide. His own gun was only half loaded. Maurice hesitated. His numbness dissolved in an instant, replaced by an overwhelming sorrow. His face contorted in pain and defeat, and he lowered his weapon. The boy gasped in shock, then ran off. A moment later, a stray bullet caught the lad's neck. He fell into a heap among the dead. Maurice groaned, looking at the sky, hands shaking. "I need to move," he realised. But he couldn't. Instead, he knelt back down, rolling Thomas's body onto his back. Blood ran down the corpse's mouth. But instead of Thomas, it was Soleil's dead, lifeless eyes that stared back at him. Maurice woke screaming. His own. He was on a cold, splintered floor, gasping for breath. Someone was pounding on the wall from an adjacent apartment. "Oi!" a muffled voice called out. "Keep it down!" Maurice's cheeks flared in humiliation. "I had a fit," he realised, blinking away tears as the image of Soleil lingered in his thoughts. Yet, unlike the past, neither his daughter nor his wife were there to comfort him. For the former was hundreds of lieues away, and the latter was gone from this world. He braced himself on the mattress, pulling himself to the edge of the bed. Staring back at the floor, he gripped at his chest, trying to quell the flaring ache inside. "Oh, Pearl," he thought with regret. "How can I bear to return to you without her?" Footsteps tore him from his thoughts. Maurice sighed. "I'm sorry," he said, assuming one of the neighbours had come at the sound of his cries. "I'm all right. I simply had a—" He stopped, eyes growing wide as he finally looked up. A short man draped in black stood above him, a quiver against his back, eyes the only portion of him visible in the darkness. Strangely, a single red rose was tucked into the man's heavy tunic. "Who are you?" Maurice asked roughly. The man didn't respond, simply reaching down and grabbing Maurice by the collar. "Stop!" Maurice shouted, fighting back with fresh strength. Yet the intruder was strong, stronger than he looked given his small frame. Maurice's chest grew cold as ice. "Help!" he shouted out in fear. "Someone, please! Help!" He stopped, cries stifled, as the man held him in place and pressed a damp cloth over his mouth. "Paul!" Maurice thought, a dozen regrets crossing his mind within seconds. He cared little for his own life at this point. But what would his daughter do if he didn't return? He had left her nothing but an empty home, and even that wouldn't be hers, for the law wouldn't let her inherit anything as a woman. Belle didn't even have a penny to her dowry. How could she ever survive this world alone? Maurice gasped against the cloth, letting one lingering cry hang in the air. "Will no one help me?" He wondered desperately, mind beginning to fade with whatever drug had moistened the cloth. A moment later, he fell into darkness. There were some who had heard his weak calls for help, but no one came. Paris was full of lunatics, after all. So those who heard simply buried their heads further beneath their covers. Adam's hands were trembling. He still hadn't taken a breath, watching as the enchantress emerged slowly from the trees. Her face was hooded, but it did little to hide those eyes. Had they always glowed? "Adam?" Belle asked softly, soft fingers against his cheek. "Not a word, my pet," the witch went on. She raised a thin arm, pointing a lazy finger up at the trees behind her. His eyes followed, then grew wide. Dark, masked figures filled the branches, crouching in the shadows surrounding Abel's peak. Each held a bow, arrows pulled back and aimed directly for the woman in his arms. He pulled Belle closer, arms trembling. How was this happening? "Adam, what's wrong?" Belle asked in bewilderment, turning around. Her eyes scanned the path, passing right over the spot where the enchantress stood. "Did you see someone?" she asked nervously, turning back to him. Adam only blinked. Couldn't Belle see her too? Couldn't she hear her? "Oh, didn't you realize I could appear to you alone?" the witch went on, simpering. "I thought you would have realized that ability of mine by now. Made it quite easy to slip past your silly excuse for a guard." In a heartbeat, it clicked. His mother, seeing something in her vanity mirror he couldn't. Belle sleepwalking into his room, looking like she was talking to some silent, invisible presence. The enchantress could choose who she was visible to. They never had a chance, did they? "Now, you do exactly as I say, and we'll get the girl out of harm's way, the witch went on. Adam remained still. He didn't dare make a move. He might be strong, but strength would do little against 24 sharp-eyed archers. "You're feeling ill. You need to retire early for the evening." The enchantress commanded him. "Say it!" "Adam?" Belle asked again. She kept looking between him and the path behind them. She didn't see the men in the trees. What reason had she to look up there? I'm feeling ill," Adam rasped. Suddenly it wasn't a lie. "I need to retire early for the evening." "Oh, Adam!" Belle said in concern, rising to her feet and reaching for his hands. "Here, let's get back then." He nodded, not daring to say anything else. He was trapped. The walk back was torture. Adam passed his guards, each standing dutifully in place, yet entirely unaware of the evil presence lurking behind them. The witch's footsteps were silent. No prints left in the snow as she followed him and Belle down the trail. And even with his enhanced hearing, Adam could just barely catch the soft brush of padded feet in the trees, high above. Whoever they were, those archers weren't just skilled in their weaponry, but in stealth. He was surrounded on all sides, an invisible enemy behind, and a troop that may as well have been invisible above. He felt sicker by the minute, mind desperate to find a way out of this. He had prepared for a dozen other possibilities, all involving his uncle's return, or one powerful witch coming on her own. Those things he could deal with. Seeing the king's army approach through the enchanted mirror, he could send Belle and the others into hiding, have the witch come herself, and he could be warned by his guard and take her on alone. But this... God, it was so simple, and he hadn't seen it coming at all. He reached out for Belle's hand, where it rested on Olive's saddle, glancing up in an effort to keep an eye on the men above. "Eyes ahead, beast," the witch ordered him. He grit his teeth, but obeyed, staring back down at the sloping path. "Adam," Belle said, looking into the trees where he had glanced just a moment before. The men had anticipated that, it seemed, ducking away into the shadows before she could spot them. She looked back at him, frowning. Are you sure you didn't see something? You seem so nervous." "You didn't see anything," the witch said from behind him. He could hear the amusement in her voice. "You're just tired."
"I didn't see anything,"
Adam said flatly. He hated himself for it. Hated the enchantress for making him lie to her.
"I'm just tired."
Belle bit her lip, but nodded. She seemed anxious, concerned, and worst of all, confused. That didn't matter, though. Not now. All that mattered was getting her out of this alive. His heart flooded instantly with regret. He should never have let her stay here, not once he realized she was a target. He had been selfish, hadn't he? And now, because of him, Belle was only 1 arrow shot away from... His stomach turned and he swallowed against the bile rising in his throat.
"Oh, God above, keep her safe,"
he prayed, hoping desperately that his thoughts could be heard. Hoping, desperately, he was right about someone being there to hear them. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the eastern gates, moving within the walls and between the garden rows. Adam turned, his head slightly sideways, as much as he dared, glancing back towards the woods. The archers didn't follow, but remained in the trees. "My friends can strike a sparrow's eye from 1,000 arpents off," the witch said, as though anticipating his next thoughts. "Though perhaps you'd like to test their range on human girls." Adam clenched his teeth, staring back at the castle with fury. A fury that masked in a terrible, gut-wrenching fear. They deposited Olive at the stables, before moving up the palace steps and through the dark entryway. The guards looked understandably confused. They, like the rest, had no doubt assumed they'd be seeing their prince in a different form upon his return. No doubt they assumed they would be there to greet him with open arms of their own. But, ever loyal to their duties, the men said nothing as Adam guided Belle through the halls. He dared another quick glance. Were they being followed? These halls were dark. He couldn't be sure. "Should I send for Dr. Mathias?" He blinked, looking towards the sound of the voice. Belle was gripping his arm, looking more worried than he had ever seen her. "You really do look ill," she said, squeezing his hand. "Here, let me go see if I can find him." "Refuse her," came the voice from the shadow.
"No!" Adam told Belle. His throat was dry as sandpaper. I mean, I'm alright. I just need to sleep. And I need to keep you safe.
She bit her lip, but nodded. Take her to her room, the witch went on, sounding impatient. Unsure of what else he could do, Adam led Belle up the long, winding stairs and into the west wing. Outside her door, they stopped. Belle stared at the floor for a long moment, then looked up at him. She smiled a bit, but her confusion and worry was more than evident. I had a wonderful evening, she tried, a strange uncertainty in her voice. Don't answer, the enchantress ordered. Just nod and say good night. Adam did as he was told. Belle entered her room slowly, looking back more than once before finally shutting the door behind her. Very good, breathed the voice behind him. Adam grit his teeth, finally turning around. The enchantress smirked, then pointed towards his room. He glanced anxiously towards Belle's door again, but obeyed. Entering the darkness of his chambers, he stopped, forming fists at his side as the witch passed through behind him. Shut the door, beast! Snarling, he did so slowly, thoughts moving 1,000 miles a minute. The archers were clearly gone, and they were alone. If he could just take her out now. The door clicked, and he spun around. Claws flexed, mind made up. He charged forward with all his might, and fell into a bank of snow. Gasping, he shook his head and stood quickly, reorientating himself.
What happened? He thought desperately. Where am I?
So predictable, a cruel voice said from behind him. And don't fret so. We're still on your grounds. Just thought we needed somewhere more isolated. He turned around. The enchantress stood there, still hooded, holding an enormous mirror to her side. It had a thick golden frame, carved into elaborate patterns, and stood even taller than himself. The object must have been at least 3 times her weight, yet she held it up as if it were a flimsy piece of parchment.
How did I get here? He wondered. Where did she get that? He stopped, watching with wide eyes as the mirror began to shrink. Slowly at first, then speeding up until it was small enough to fit into the palm of one's hand. It fell into the snow, and the enchantress reached down to pick it up, tucking the delicate object into her robes. He didn't know why they were here. Didn't know why she'd let Belle go unharmed, but thank God she had. And now he had a chance he couldn't let pass by. Adam tore off his jacket, letting it fall in the snow, then dropped onto all fours, sucking in a sharp breath, and charged once again. He caught the sound of bowstrings, but it was too late to shift force as the swarm of arrows sunk into the hard earth all around him. Each struck a hair's width from his flesh, but no closer. Oh yes, and my friends are here, the enchantress went on. I wouldn't make any sudden movements if I were you. Adam looked into the trees. The archers were here, closer than before, and he could finally make out their features. Heads wrapped in black cloth, but a narrow slip of skin visible to each face that revealed dark eyes. Long black hair was pulled into knots atop their heads, and their bodies were covered in thick wraps and some kind of flexible armor. Foreigners,
Adam realized, but this was a small kingdom, and his ancestors couldn't have made such far-reaching enemies, even if they'd wanted to, which meant these were either mercenaries or men under her spells. The delicate roses tucked into each man's tunic confirmed the latter. Adam swallowed roughly, remembering the terrible feeling of an arrow sinking into his flesh. Only a moment later, he shook the thought aside and dashed towards the nearest tree. The arrows followed him, grazing against his fur, slicing through the loose cloth of his shirt. They sunk into the tree's bark all around him as he climbed,
atop the lower branches in an instant. The man there barely acknowledged him. No fear, no gasp of surprise, only hollow, lifeless eyes staring back at him. Adam, however, didn't have time to dwell on it. He simply grabbed the man's arm and squeezed. The bone crunched in his hand. He let the man fall to the ground below. Adam felt the bile rise in his throat a moment later. He'd been familiar with his strength for some time, but he'd never used it in this way until now. It surprised him how easy it had been. Better a broken arm than killing him, he thought absently, leaping towards the next tree and tossing another archer to the ground. He continued to pick them off like flies, and though the arrows continued to fly at him from all sides, not one struck flesh. Strange, he thought absently, falling to the ground and dropping the last archer into the snow. The men lay all around, breathing quietly, no groans escaping their lips. The witch herself hadn't moved, looking around as if admiring a field of tulips. Impressive, she said. She raised her hand, and a moment later, fingers sweeping forward. 24 more men appeared from the shadows at her command. Their white tunics stood bright in the darkness as they surrounded her. Each held a short curved knife in each hand, and stood completely barefoot, ankle deep in the snow. Yet they seemed not to mind. No doubt a side effect of her mind-numbing spell. How many others has she brought into this? Adam wondered with regret. Meet Nepal's hidden warriors, beast, the enchantress went on. Truly some of the bravest, most loyal defenders, though, as of yet, undiscovered by the world. Adam frowned deeply, searching the men's eyes. Those orbs held no sign of bravery, nor loyalty, no doubt washed away by her terrible, enslaving spell. Adam felt the growl in his throat, felt his heart surge with anticipation for the fight. He wasn't backing down yet. 24 men and twice as many knives wouldn't stand between him and the terror that had threatened everyone he loved. He'd fight off 1,000 of them to keep Belle safe. As the men swarmed him, it became clear that just this small troop would be plenty challenge enough. The knives swept near his chest, gleaming bright in the darkness as he batted them off. But these soldiers were quick, impossibly quick, it seemed, making swipes near his flesh before jumping immediately from his range. They seemed to dance all around him, never actually cutting him, but tearing through his blouse with each strike and leaving it hanging in shreds. Adam roared, his frustration echoing off the still forest around them. What use was strength against the years of training these men no doubt possessed? Sweating, panting, Adam did eventually start to down them one by one, though something told him they were only letting him. Throwing a paw into the last warrior's chest, Adam finally stood tall, exhausted. Yet when he turned around, another soldier had taken his place. Adam looked up into the man's pale eyes. Yes, up, for the man towered several inches over him. He wore a massive, fur-coated helmet that made him seem even taller than he already was. The rose in his cravat was in full bloom. Adam heard more boots in the snow. Looking up and gasping in shock, dozens more of these enormous men were emerging onto the snow, stepping straight from a pond that bordered the clearing. Its surface was coated in ice, reflecting the stars above. Potsdam's giants, the enchantress exclaimed, as the men formed a uniform line behind her. The Prussian king really has quite the obsession with creating this unit. Many are the product of recruiting the nation's largest men, forced to bear children with their tallest women. Yet, despite years of preparation, the poor souls never had the chance to see combat. She paused, grinning. I thought I'd do them a favour and grant them that chance now. The soldier before him pulled a giant musket from his back. It held a jagged, razor-sharp bayonet. The men behind aimed their own guns straight for Adam's heart. Adam breathed heavily, breath forming clouds in the cool air, forcing himself to think. There was no way he could break past these men alive, at least assuming they were trying to kill him. And something told him they weren't. He stepped forward, heart thundering in his chest, letting the giant soldier swing the bayonet. Adam watched, heart in his throat, as it passed straight over his head. Releasing a breath, he took the opportunity to charge at the others. They fired at once, deafening him for a moment, smoke filling his lungs. Yet not a single bullet found its mark. Hurling himself through the troops' line, Adam raced towards the enchantress, throwing one heavy paw behind him and swung with all his might. Something caught his wrist. Something solid, strong, and immovable. Adam looked down, eyes growing wide at what he saw. The enchantress held him in one small, delicate hand. Her red lips grew into a smirk beneath that hood. He was in the air in an instant, tossed aside like a rag doll. He landed hard, rolling twice and falling to a rest in the snow once again. "Oh!" he gasped, pulling himself onto his knees. His shoulder was throbbing from where he had landed on it. The enchantress just laughed, waving the remaining men away. "You really think I'd create something stronger than myself?" she asked. "I'm not a fool." Adam stared at his paws, still buried in the snow. "She's been toying with me," he realized. He looked up at the Prussian soldiers, now disappearing into the trees. "She never even needed these men. She's manipulating me, even now." And it had worked. She had given him the chance to fight, wore him down slowly, and then shown him just how powerless he really was. Of course he couldn't beat her. He was a fool to think he could. And what was he going to do now? "Are you finished, beast?" she asked, examining one long nail. "Really, so much fuss. I only wish to talk." Adam stood slowly, clothes in shreds, hands in tight fists. He didn't answer. "You must be tired of that body," she began casually, looking back at him. Adam only frowned, the corners of his nose curling into rage and humiliation. "Well, fortunately for you," she went on, "I am here to offer you an end to this curse." He frowned further, growl in his throat. "What are you talking about?" he snarled. "You've been trying to stop me from breaking it!" "Oh no," she said softly, bringing her hands out in front of her in a sign of peace. "No, you have it all wrong. I've always wanted you to break it." Adam blinked. "What?" "It's true. You were meant to break it from the beginning, dearest." She paused, voice growing dark. "Just not with her." "Not with—" Adam huffed in irritation. "Stop toying with me, witch! I'm not a child anymore." Her smile, just visible beneath the cloak, became an unnerving grin. "No," she said, pulling back her hood and stepping forward. "No, you are not." Her long white gold hair fell in waves to her waist, the cloak falling away to reveal a tight red gown that shone unnaturally bright in the darkness. Her face was young, younger even than when she had first appeared to him, and she had a body to match. She smiled, lips red and full, moving before him in an instant and resting a hand on his chest. Adam staggered back in alarm. "Well, what are you doing?" "Not your type?" she asked lightly, before raising one finger in the air. "Oh, that's right. You like brunettes." She grinned, touching the tip of one finger to her temple. Her hair seemed to flutter of its own accord, brown colour seeping from roots to tips like paint. "Oh!" Adam cried in disgust, a terrible realization flooding over him at once. You meant me to break the spell with you?"
Well, I had always wanted your father, but you were a suitable replacement. She smiled again, licking her lips. A very suitable replacement.
Adam shuddered, bringing his paws to his temples. If he felt sick earlier, the feeling was tenfold now.
I know what men want, Prince Adam, she went on, moving towards him on silent feet. Power, wealth, sex. I could give it all to you.
"Get away from me!" he shouted, staggering backwards and bumping into one of the great trees lining the clearing.
Just imagine it, she went on, voice dripping like syrup against the open air. Her appearance shifted, brown waves curling into tight ringlets of red, face forming anew. You could have any woman you desire. She changed again, growing short and black as her body narrowed. A different girl each night.
"I don't want that!" Adam cried in terror, paws scrambling for the trunk behind him and pushing himself away so he could move further back. "I just want Belle," he thought, a strange, foreboding sorrow washing over him. Though he wanted her as far from the enchantress as possible, another part of him wished for Belle to be right with him now. Because, in all truth, he was scared. And strangely, it was in that moment he thought of Gaston, the man who had stalked Belle from her youth, abused and threatened her to get his way, and somehow still expected her to want him. Adam looked back at the enchantress, so sure she could sway him despite all she had done. God, this woman wasn't so different from Gaston, was she? Adam shuddered. He had always sympathized with Belle, felt immense anger towards Gaston for what he had done to her, but had never imagined he'd be on the end of this too. He felt so gross and terrible. He shook his head in utter disbelief at what was happening. "How could you ever expect me to be tempted by the person who cursed me and my household?" he asked. "Who took my father away? Who murdered my mother?" He paused, breathing heavily. "Are you insane?" She only shook her head, resting two hands on her hips. "Jumping to conclusions, just like your father," she tut-tutted. "No, love. Your dear maman isn't dead." Adam's heart seemed to stop. "What?" "It's true," she went on softly. "And I can bring her back. Bring them both back." She produced the palm-sized mirror once again, letting it fall in the snow. It grew in an instant, creaking as it did so, and falling heavily against the adjacent oak. "And things," she breathed, "can be just as they should be." Someone appeared in the mirror. After a long moment of hesitation, Adam moved closer, and so did the figure. It was a man, standing in the snow-covered landscape within its depths, his hand reaching near Adam's shoulders. He was lean through the middle, yet broad-chested and well-built, with a head of long auburn hair, and a strong nose and brow. "Papa," Adam rasped, reaching out and resting a hand on the mirror's surface. His father did the same, their fingers meeting as one. He looked back, bright blue eyes staring up at him. Adam gasped. His father's eyes were brown, Not blue.
Handsome, aren't you?
A familiar voice spoke from beside him, though he barely heard it. That's me. Adam realized in shock. He saw the differences now. Hair a shade darker, and a bit redder. Chin more square. The angle softer than his father's. Adam reached up to touch his own face, the reflection doing the same. He could feel his fur, his fangs, yet the young man in the mirror had neither of those things. A couple appeared in the mirror behind his human reflection. They stood further off, clasping hands. The woman's bright blue eyes watching him for a long moment, before a warm, familiar smile washed over her face. Mama! Adam choked out. The man beside her nodded at him, wrapping an arm around the Queen's shoulders. His father. Adam turned around in hopes of seeing them behind him. Yet the forest was empty as ever. He turned back, reaching for the glass again, and willing it to let him through. It remained hard as stone, so he simply watched them, unable to tear his eyes away. Someone else appeared then, stepping into the reflection and drawing close. Belle looked at Adam's human form, weaving one arm through his, as her other hand swept over his chest. The illusion was enough to make Adam's heart race, his breath catch in his throat. You can have everything you want. Your family, your body, even her. Belle spoke. Adam was too distracted to think what that could mean, as Belle reached up in the mirror, fingers grazing his fleshed cheek. Adam could have sworn he felt it, looking away from the reflection to his side. Belle really stood beside him, there in the centre of the dark forest. Belle! He gasped. What are you? She looked up at him then, eyes as red as blood. Adam bristled, pulling away in an instant, stumbling back into the snow. No! He gasped, backing away. Yes, Prince Adam, I can be her. The enchantress spoke through Belle's stolen voice, following him on silent feet. I can be better than her. She sucked in a breath, and in an instant her lips grew full and bright, breasts filling out as her waist narrowed unnaturally. Hair flowing to twice its length and thickness. The pretty freckles across her nose disappeared, and that one wavy strand of Belle's hair that never seemed to stay in place suddenly tucked itself out of sight. She hadn't changed forms completely, still recognisably Belle, but at the same time, it wasn't Belle at all. Adam looked away, gritting his teeth in anger. How dare you! He snarled. He felt his arms tremble, felt his fists clench at his side. How dare you defile her form in such a way? How dare you think you can ever be even a sliver of what Belle is? The enchantress seemed to falter, the false features disappearing so that she returned to Belle's true form. But I am her. No, you're not. Belle isn't Belle because of what she looks like, he said. It felt like the most obvious statement in the world, yet the enchantress seemed confused by it. He raised a brow. You really think that's all I care about? He asked in surprise. The witch only blinked, hair starting to lighten again, Belle's face already unrecognisable as she shifted back into her original form. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, for the first time at a loss for words. And suddenly, everything made sense. You don't even know what love is, do you? Adam asked quietly. She bristled, cheeks flaring in anger. I know enough, she shouted. It was too dark to be sure, but it seemed that tears had formed in the corner of her eyes.
No. You know nothing,
Adam said firmly. He brought his paw to his head, and despite everything, a short, bitter laugh escaped him.
It all makes sense now. Everything you've done, everything you've tried.
He stopped, shaking his head.
No wonder you failed.
I can still kill her, she cried, though her voice faltered. Adam narrowed his eyes, suddenly unconvinced. The enchantress had known about Belle for weeks, if not longer, yet hadn't harmed her. She had even appeared to Belle in the middle of the night, yet hadn't led her off the edge of a balcony in her sleep, or even to the wolf-infested woods that she had his mother. Why?
You can't hurt her,
he realised, staring absently at the ground. He looked up slowly.
Somehow, the spell is stopping you from harming Belle, isn't it?
She bared her teeth, hissing in the quiet night air. An immeasurable relief washed over him. Relief and confidence.
I am going home, and I am going to tell Belle I love her,
he said with conviction, standing tall.
We are going to break your heartless spell, give my friends their lives, and be done with you forever.
He turned to leave, then paused, looking back over his shoulder.
You failed witch. Be gone.
Behind him, the enchantress's heavy, angry breathing filled the cold night air. I haven't failed yet, she spat. Adam turned back slowly, frowning as she threw out her arm and slapped it against the mirror's large surface. Perhaps the girl is beyond my reach, the witch snarled, but those she loves are not. The reflection changed yet again, this time showing a dark room with a single bed. Someone lay there, asleep it seemed, while another figure stood in the shadows beside him. The witch tut-tutted at the image, looking back at Adam. Poor man, she drawled, all alone in Paris. Looking back at the mirror, she made a sharp motion with one hand. The lurking presence inside moved at her command. His dear wife gone from this world, she went on. Standing figure stopped beside the bed, pulling an arrow from his quiver.
Another archer,
Adam realised, watching in a nervous confusion, as though reading his thoughts. The archer rolled the sleeping man over so that he was facing them. Adam's heart flew into his throat, recognition sweeping over him in an instant. Perhaps, the enchantress went on, grinning wickedly, perhaps he would like to join her.
No,
Adam croaked, starting to panic. He ran towards the mirror and threw his shoulder against it. Yet it was as solid as before. He could only pull back, watching in horror as the archer knocked the arrow to his bow. No! Adam cried desperately. No, please! Belle can't lose him too. I don't care, the enchantress said heartlessly. Raising one arm high in the air, the archer pulled back, aiming the arrow straight for Maurice's heart. Please, I'll do anything! Adam shouted. His voice was harsh, echoing off the cold forest floors. He gripped the edge of the frame, gasping for breath. Anything! Anything, She stopped, voice growing low and cold. Even give her up? A crushing weight seemed to fall on Adam's chest. A sudden, cold dread as he realised what was coming. It's either you or him, she offered, eyes narrowing. You decide. Which man will Belle keep in her life? Adam's hands slid down the mirror's golden frame, and he fell to his knees in the snow. Oh, Father! He choked out, paws trembling against the earth. She keeps her father. The enchantress lowered her arm, her terrible presence now towering above him. Very good. Belle's fingers brushed the books along the wall, lingering on the hidden painted leather before pulling away. She bit her lip hard, turning back towards the dark room. The yellow gown was draped over a chair by the hearth, the small fire making it glow orange in the darkness. She realized belatedly that she had come back without asking anyone for help removing it. She had managed on her own, though with no small amount of difficulty, tugging at the interlaced ribbons along her back, hands trembling with nerves as she tried to understand what had gone wrong. For something had definitely gone wrong. She paced the room for the 10th time now, stopping before the hidden passage once again. Sucking in a breath, she sighed in defeat, turning back towards her bed. She tucked herself into the covers, breathing in their scent. They still smelled like him from the night before, though she was certain he wouldn't be joining her again tonight. Adam was going to say something important, but then he had stopped. And what had made him so nervous? And more importantly, why had he then grown so cold? She chewed the inside of her lip now, tasting blood. Calm down. He said he was feeling ill, remember? She told herself. And why would he lie about that? Adam never lied. She lay there for a long while, worrying about how sick he might be. Worrying he wasn't really sick at all. Perhaps I've been too eager, she wondered. She had overheard some things in the village, peeking over the edges of her books, and listening quietly while the triplets planned their next plot to secure Gaston for themselves. Better play hard to get. You don't want to scare the man away. No one likes a forward woman. Belle snorted to herself. Ironic coming from those three. She sighed, shaking her head, realizing that she was being foolish. What she had with Adam, it wasn't some game. It was real, and the two of them had never been ones to skirt around the truth before. Still, Adam had looked nervous, terribly. She wondered at first he had seen something in the trees, but maybe that wasn't it at all. Maybe he'd simply begun to second-guess things about where things were going between them. Where are things going between us? Belle wondered. She thought back over the night, to all the wonderful and warm moments together. Very warm moments together. Belle flushed, covering her face in her hands, despite being alone in the darkness. She curled up into herself, recalling the way Adam's fingers had brushed down her neck, how he had caressed the skin beneath her sleeve. She had sighed, feeling things, wanting things she had never realized she had wanted. Maybe that's what he's worried about, part of her wondered. She pulled her hands down, rolling onto her back as she thought. Maybe he's still worried about what he is, about what we could be together. He had barely come around to the idea that he was still human, at his core, at least, a few short months ago. And he'd only recently accepted himself as a prince again, dethroned as he was. Perhaps the idea that he could live even a semi-normal life was still more than he could comprehend. Imagining a normal life with him, though, well, that wasn't hard for her. It would be a sacrifice, of course. For one, they'd be trapped there. For even if Adam could leave, the outside world could never understand him as he was, or what they had together. Nor could Adam kiss her, touch her in the ways humans could. And whatever they decided regarding their intimacy, Belle had a feeling children wouldn't be possible. She flushed, realizing where her thoughts had led. Am I really thinking about marrying him? Well, where else did you think this would lead? Another part of her countered. And so Belle let herself think about it, let herself imagine what might be. She saw herself in a white veil, kneeling beside him at the chapel's grand altar as they made the greatest vows of their lives. She imagined lying with him each night, his gentle hands caressing her skin. She imagined visiting the fair each year, bringing home a wagon full of new books they could share, spending their evenings curled up together beside the fire. And maybe, one year, she could visit the orphanage in St. Armand and bring home a little one who needed them. The thought of Adam holding a child, their child. Belle brought a hand to her chest, heart bursting at the thought of it all. This was all she wanted. Adam was all she wanted, and finally, she couldn't ignore it any longer. I love him, she whispered into the darkness. The quiet air, of course, didn't reply, but Belle didn't care. A wide smile tugged at her lips, never recalling a time she'd ever felt more wonderful and warm. Something tapped at the edge of the bed then. Max tucked his nose under the covers, and Belle turned to face him. Max, she said excitedly, I love him. He licked her face, and Belle laughed lightly as she gave him a squeeze. Of course she loved Adam. How long had it been? Every novel she had read made love seem like some grand, momentous event. Yet, for her, it had been gradual, though no less powerful. Powerful and peaceful, all at once. Well, however long she had loved him, tonight she had finally admitted it to herself. And tomorrow, she thought firmly, I'll tell him. Adam barely registered the image of Maurice's room growing dark again as he knelt in the snow. Instead, he let his face fall into his hands. He'd had to stop the enchantress from killing Belle's father. It wasn't a question. But it still felt no better than if he had thrust his claws into his chest and torn out his own heart. He should have thought of this. Of course she would find some way to threaten them. And what could he do about it? Go to Paris and bring Maurice back here? Even without his invisible prison, even without the snow-covered pass or his terrifying form, it would have been impossible to keep Maurice safe. The enchantress could go anywhere she wished, recruit any warrior in this world to her side. And she'd just proved herself 10 times stronger than him. God, he really was powerless. Adam felt his throat grow tight, his chest ache like it hadn't ached in years. He should have just sent Belle away that first day she'd come. He'd let himself hope. He'd let himself love in a way he had never even imagined was possible. And now it was over. Beside him, the enchantress huffed to herself. She sounded annoyed. I had really wanted you to send her away yourself. It would have been so much more satisfying. She paused, humming to herself for a long moment, before smiling once again. But perhaps you still can.
No, wait!
Adam gasped, looking up in fear.
She can't go back there alone. Gaston, he'll...
Oh, that's right. The brute from town? She asked, waving a lazy hand in the air. She placed her fingers against the glass once more, yet another image starting to fill its surface. Let's check on him.
No,
Adam said, his eyes narrowing in suspicion.
I'll check on him myself.
He pulled the hand mirror from his belt, letting its cloth cover fall into the snow. For some reason, the witch's nose curled up at the sight of it, and she took a step back.
Show me, Gaston.
Adam ordered, ignoring her. The mirror complied, casting greenish shadows across the dark clearing. And there he was, Gaston, curled up in a small, stone-walled space, thick bars trapping him inside.
He's in prison,
Adam breathed in shock. Yes, I put him there for you, the witch said. She sounded exasperated. Adam frowned deeper, entirely unconvinced. Why are you surprised? She asked. I wish the girl no harm. I simply want her back where she belongs.
Belle belongs here.
Adam swallowed roughly.
Can he get out on bail?
He demanded. No bail for this one, she stated.
And when is his trial?
Trial? The witch laughed. Your uncle ended those years ago. Prison, or more often the workhouse, is a life sentence for anyone these days. Adam clenched his jaw. He couldn't even contemplate the horror of such news in light of everything else. He sucked in a breath, trying to push away the tumble of emotions and focus.
Is she lying?
He asked the mirror, eyes not leaving the enchantress for a long moment. She looked incredibly annoyed. The mirror in his hands took a moment to respond, but eventually showed a small child slowly shaking her head. Enough of this, the enchantress said, patience dried up. Now listen to me. If you want to keep that pathetic farmer alive, you'll see that the girl's gone at first light tomorrow. Adam's heart fell into his stomach.
I can't, he breathed. I can't just send her away.
Oh, I'm sure you can think of some way to persuade her. She grinned wickedly. And it will be quite entertaining to see what you come up with.
I'll tell her the truth, he said, gripping the mirror hard, eyes burning with tears. I'll tell her what you've done.
Careful now, the witch said seriously. One thing I've learned about that girl is that she's stubborn. I wouldn't be surprised if she returns with her father in a few months' time. She paused, eyes narrowing, and the moment she steps foot in these woods, the deal's off. Adam imagined an arrow running through Maurice's heart, his body falling into a heap on the forest floor, Belle sobbing at his side. His chest grew tight, and he stared at the ground. Still, the enchantress continued, I'll let you decide. Perhaps she will stay. You know her better than I, after all. She shrugged. I won't leave you! Belle's words, at one time so comforting, now filled Adam's heart with fear. Even if she knew the truth, Belle would return. He knew she would. And suddenly, terribly, Adam realized what he needed to do. He would have rather the witch had asked him jump off a cliff than go through with this. You have until daybreak tomorrow, she said, mirth gone from her eyes. And you will speak to no one else of this, or the deal's off. You understand, beast? Adam fought the sickness in his stomach, feeling much like the small child he had been when the enchantress had first appeared. Weak, defenseless, useless. He couldn't stop her from taking his parents, couldn't stop her from cursing his household. And now he couldn't stop her from tearing away the one person he loved the most. He ducked his head, squeezing his eyes shut in defeat.
I understand.
Adam stood behind the stables in the darkness of early morning, bracing himself against the barn wall. He heaved once, twice, then vomited into the dirt. The remnants of dinner the night before had long been expelled, and his mouth now tasted of the acid that had been forcing itself up during his long, sleepless night.
I can't do this,
he thought for the 100th time, paws quaking against the barn's splintered walls, knowing he would soon need to wake Belle. He thought desperately all night for some way, any way, to get out of this. How he wished he could seek help. From Mrs. Potts, Sir Giles, even old Cogsworth. But perhaps it was better this way. His fault or not, his father's burden was his responsibility now. He wanted to tell Belle the truth. Oh, how badly he did. But for once, the enchantress was right. Belle was loyal, and so wonderfully stubborn. She wouldn't abandon him if she knew the enchantress had threatened him. She'd try to find a way to protect her father, then come back for him. But Adam knew it was useless. If she returned, Maurice would be dead in a day, and it would be his fault. How could they ever be together, knowing he'd been the cause of that? How could he ever live with himself, knowing he was the reason her father died? No. There was only one option that didn't end with Maurice in a pool of blood. And that was to convince Belle that he didn't want her here. Adam? His heart flew into his throat, hearing her soft footfalls in the snow. It was time. Adam forced his feet to move back to the front of the stable. There she stood, Max at her side, glancing this way and that in confusion, before catching sight of him. She rushed to his side. Adam! Belle breathed, a look of relief crossing her face as she reached for his cheek. How are you feeling? He forced himself to remain still, forced himself not to reach down and pull her close.
Butter,
he lied. She pulled her hand away, fingers curling against her palm. She hesitated, then reached for his paw. Did you sleep well? She asked quietly. He hummed, trying not to think of the way her hand felt in his, trying not to think of how it might be the last time he felt it. Adam, she said again, sucking in a nervous breath and staring at their hands. There's something I need to...
I'm going to bring some more supplies to the bunker this morning, he said quickly. He stopped, swallowing hard. Will you help me?
Oh, of course, Belle said, pulling away and leaving his paw feeling as cold as ice. She pursed her lips, then turned and entered the stables. He followed slowly. Whose turn is it? She said as they moved inside, walking towards one of the fast doors. Biscuit, we haven't brought you out in a while. How would you like to?
No, Adam said roughly. No. Let's take Philippe today.
Oh, Belle said, furrowing her brows and stepping away from the painted mare. All right. She moved back towards Philippe's stall, where the large horse had his head hung into the adjacent stall. Olive was pressed against the wooden barrier, letting the larger horse hang his head over her neck. Ah, Philippe, Belle chuckled. Did you make a lady friend? The horse huffed, looking away as if in embarrassment. Olive nudged him, and he turned back, giving in and nuzzling her long neck. Don't worry, Belle went on warmly, securing his reins. You'll see her again this afternoon. Adam turned away, squeezing his eyes shut for a long moment. Then he moved back outside the wagon he had prepared earlier. He breathed in deeply, then pulled the enchanted mirror from his belt. He stared at it for a long moment.
Protect her,
he told it quietly.
Any way you can.
The surface changed slowly, almost sadly. Adam saw a full deck of people, waving handkerchiefs for those they loved along the pier below as their ship pulled into the open ocean. Adam swallowed roughly, wrapping the mirror in a handkerchief of his own and tucking it carefully among the other things. Then he pulled the cover over the wagon and glanced at the sky. It was starting to lighten. Dawn couldn't be more than half an hour away. Belle soon emerged with Philippe. Adam secured the horse to the wagon in silence. Belle stood beside him, chewing her lip. Adam, are you sure everything's all right? She finally asked. He nodded slowly. She sounded so anxious, so timid. It made him feel even worse. Did I do something to upset you? She went on, wringing her hands together. It was all he could do not to turn around and tell her everything right there. Instead, he looked away as he spoke.
Let's talk on the way.
Belle paled considerably. Oh, all right, she whispered. They walked to the gates in silence. Belle pulled her hair from her face a dozen times, wringing Philippe's reins ever tighter between her fingers.
I can't do this,
Adam thought again, looking up towards the tree line. And there she was, that terrible monster, making him hurt the woman he loved. The enchantress watched him with narrow eyes for a long moment. Then she glanced pointedly towards the approaching sunrise and disappearing. Limbs quaking, Adam opened the gate and let Belle guide the horse and wagon towards the path. She stopped at the sound of the gate closing, turning back and staring at him with wide eyes. Adam pulled the key from the bolt, still within the palace walls. The heavy iron gates separated them. Adam, what's going on? She breathed.
You've repaid your father's debt,
he stated, voice hoarse.
I no longer require your services.
Belle stared at him incredulously. What are you talking about? He cringed but went on.
I made a mistake,
he tried, fighting back a fresh wave of nausea.
You are no longer welcome here.
Belle breathed heavily, a myriad of emotions crossing her face. She turned back to the wagon, tearing off the cover. Her eyes widened further at its contents. Her easel and paints, Philippe's saddle, a case of clothes, several sacks of coins, and the precious book she had given him, plus several dozens more. Belle shook her head roughly, stepping away and looking back at him in disbelief. I don't understand, she whispered. Adam only looked away. If this is about what you are, I don't care, she cried. He heard her move back through the snow, sensing her near the gates. We can make this work, Adam. Please, she pled, voice shaking. I... Adam looked back, overwhelmed by her words. She gripped the heavy steel bars, eyes filling with tears. Every fibre of his being wanted to tear those gates open and take it all back, to tell her that he loved her and hold her close and never let her go. But instead, he forced himself to turn away once again.
It's over, Belle, he rasped. Go home.
But this is my... She stopped, sucking in a shaky breath. You can't make me leave, she said. He caught the sound of 2 tears dripping into the snow.
Belle, don't make me do this.
I promised Chip I would stay, she gasped.
Please, don't make me do this.
He thought in agony. He glanced at the sky, the sun's rays growing ever brighter on the horizon. His chest flooded with fear and desperation. And the others, she went on bravely, they'll think...
Am I not the master here?
He shouted, turning back sharply, forcing himself to meet her eyes. Belle stopped, mouth gaping in shock. Beside her, Max whined in confusion.
Get!
Adam gasped, clenching his fists to stop their trembling. He rose to his full height, swallowing roughly.
Get out,
he breathed. He sucked in a breath. baring his teeth and feeling his heart tear open inside of him. "Get out!" His roar echoed off the trees, monstrous and terrifying, even to his own ears. Max barked once, growling weakly, then fell silent as he pawed Belle's leg. To Belle's credit, she didn't back away, but her eyes did grow wide and terrified. Terrified of him. It was what he wanted. And nothing had ever hurt so much in his life. Belle stared at him for another long, heartbreaking moment. Then she turned away, climbing slowly into the wagon and picking up the reins with quaking hands. "Let's go, Philippe," she whispered. The wagon moved slowly down the trail, disappearing between the dark trees just as dawn broke over the mountain tops. Adam watched it go, gripping the iron bars, reaching between them towards the shrinking wagon, and forcing himself not to run after it.
"I'll never see her again."
He hadn't even realized he'd fallen to his knees. Yet, here he was, staring into the snow. He grabbed at his heart, ignoring the claws digging into his flesh. He then threw back his head and cried out. Had anyone heard, they would think it the sound of a starving, lonely animal, not that of a man. But a man it was.
"Ah, perfect."
Gaston snatched the bag from the guard's hands and pulled out a handful of raw eggs, eyeing them longingly. He popped one into his mouth and swallowed it whole. The guard watched him with a mixture of awe and disgust, then shook his head. "How much longer you thinking you'll be here?" the man asked, sounding faintly annoyed.
"Not long now, I think,"
Gaston said, downing a few more eggs before turning back towards his cot. The guard behind him sighed, his heavy keys jingling at his belt as he moved back down the long prison hall. Gaston finished his breakfast, then laid on his back. In truth, he was getting a bit impatient. Had he his own way, he'd have had that hideous beast's head by now and Belle in his bed. But if that magical lady was offering to hand Belle over to him herself, well, that might just make things easier. Suddenly, something bright flashed in the dark cell then. Gaston sat up, looking towards the source. The small wash basin glowed, then faded quickly. He hurried over, looking into his reflection. "Hello, Gaston." Not his reflection, but the witch's. He grinned. "She's on her way." The woman spoke.
"About time,"
Gaston said, licking his lips in anticipation. The witch narrowed her eyes. "You remember the plan?" she asked.
"Sure," Gaston said. "Just keep her in town. Easy enough."
"That's right," she said. "And that's it. Remember, the beast is
yours." Yeah, I get it,"
Gaston said absently. The woman in the dim reflection nodded, then disappeared. Gaston waited until she was gone, then hollered for the guard. The man came a minute later, raising a brow. "You ready to leave?" "Sure am," Gaston said, waiting for the man to unlock the cell and let him out. Not that he couldn't have torn the door open himself, had he wanted to. "So, did you get the experience you were after?" the guard asked. He still looked as bewildered as when Gaston had shown up 2 days before.
"I guess you could say that,"
Gaston said. In truth, he hadn't a clue why he'd needed to be here. But if it made that witch think he was playing along with all this, then so be it. The guard shook his head but didn't press the issue as they neared a small closet. The guard looked both ways, then unlocked the door and pulled it open. "There's your things," he said, nodding towards the pile of weapons. Gaston smirked, pulling another sack of coins from his vest and tossing it to the older man. The guard grinned a bit, tucking the money into his pocket. Couldn't help but peek in the sack, he admitted, and Gaston pulled the quiver over his back. Can't imagine what you need all those things for. Gaston chuckled darkly. Well, let's just say I finally found the perfect bait, he said, and I'm not going to let my prey get away from me this time. Your Highness? The sun was high in the sky when the small mantle clock forced his way through the heavy snow. My lord, Cogsworth went on, we were, simply wondering how things went last night. He stopped in his tracks, catching sight of the young prince. He lay still as stone near the gates. Prince Adam! Gaston cried, rushing over as fast as his small legs could carry him, pressing 2 cold metal hands against the prince's large form. Gaston let out a breath of relief. The young lord still breathed. Prince Adam, he asked nervously, are you well? The young man remained still a long, quiet moment, then slowly forced his massive form to rise. Mrs. Potts was inquiring after the mademoiselle, Gaston went on, clearing his throat in discomfort. Is she here? Adam turned back towards the older man from where he sat. The fur on his cheeks was soaked with tears. My lord, Cogsworth said with worry, and no small amount of fear. He reached out again, resting one golden hand on the lad's arm as high as he could reach. Cogsworth was rarely one to show affection, but even he had grown quite a soft spot for the prince after all these years. He waited, patting the prince's arm in an awkward attempt at comfort, waiting until the young man was ready to speak. Cogsworth's worry-prone mind conjuring up a dozen terrible possibilities, but never could have guessed what he would hear next. I sent her away, Adam choked out. Cogsworth gaped. You what? He asked in disbelief. But my lord, I thought... Gaston stopped. Long before the young woman had appeared, he had accepted his fate. Of course, her appearance had given him as much hope as the others. Yet, at the same time, he had been almost more pleased at how much joy she had brought to their young master. Maybe he'd die an old rusty clock. Of course, he could only speak for himself. But to see their prince send away the woman he so clearly loved, that seemed worse somehow. Why had he done it? Cogsworth shook his ears, gears clinking in his invisible ears. My prince, I don't understand, he said. How could you do that? I had to, the prince said, staring at the empty trail beyond the gates. Yes, but why? Because... Adam stopped, looking like he wished to say more. Instead, a look of resolve swept over his face, even amidst the pain. Because, he repeated, softer this time. I love her. Quiet sobs filled the forest. Belle had guided Philippe just beyond the palace grounds, but couldn't bear to go further. Face pressed against the horse's short, rough hair, she stood on trembling legs and cried. Philippe looked back at her every few moments in concern, while Max nudged anxiously at Belle's leg, his whines filling the air around them. Adam had been right. Belle was terrified, but not for the reason he had thought. Oh, Max, she finally managed, looking down at him. Did you see it too? The dog pawed at her leg again, cocking his head. His eyes, Belle whispered, looking back towards the trail behind them. I've never seen them look so frightened. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that one. Oh my god, my throat. And the emotions, oh my god. Cersei, you're really starting to get on my nerves. And, Gaston the Predator for Belle and Cersei the Predator for Adam? The creepy undertones from the prologue are coming back full force. The one thing I really liked about this was Adam's response to Cersei taking Belle's form and perverting it. The way he said, like, how dare you defile her form? Yes, King. And I love how he so clearly says, and that's not what he cares about. Oh, I love it. And, oh my days, that was just angsty, wasn't it? That was, as fun as it was to yell those emotions, I'm tired now. And let me tell you, my throat is sore. Anyway, sorry about any interruptions again you might have heard, or differing audio quality. I am looking into getting a new mic in a few months' time. I need to save up some money first. Anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment and subscribe, and hit that bell to get notified for whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals and non-bino pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care.